The opulent library was so quiet, you could hear the rain lashing against the tall, arched windows, each drop a frantic finger tapping on the glass. The only exit was blocked by a silhouette that seemed to absorb the dim, golden light of the room. A man whose sheer size was an act of intimidation. Dominic Caruso planted a hand firmly on the mahogany bookshelf, beside Elena Rivera's head, the sound a dull thud that echoed the frantic hammering of her own heart. She was trapped, the scent of old paper and his expensive cologne filling her senses, a dizzying mix of fear and an infuriating, undeniable flicker of attraction. He leaned in, his proximity a violation, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through her bones. "You thought you could run from me, Elena. I told you. Every word you spoke that night. I'm going to make you eat them, one by one." She refused to shrink away, lifting her chin in a show of defiance she didn't entirely feel. "You don't scare me, Dominic." A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips, a chilling sight that did not reach his dark, intense eyes. "Don't I? We'll see about that, Bellissima." Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long, clean lines across Elena Rivera's apartment, a space as modern and minimalist as her own mind. Every surface was clear, every object had its place. It was a sanctuary of order in a world of chaos, a reflection of the precision with which she lived her life. She moved through her morning routine with an ingrained focus, the ritual of grinding fresh coffee beans, the careful selection of her work attire, a tailored charcoal gray suit, all part of a system designed to fortify her for the day ahead. Her apartment overlooked the sprawling city, a concrete jungle she had fought hard to conquer a piece of. And as she sipped her black coffee, she felt a familiar sense of self-reliant pride. She needed no one. This core belief was the bedrock of her professional life. At her office, a high-end architectural firm where glass walls and steel beams created an atmosphere of cutting-edge ambition, Elena was a respected project manager. She was known for her sharp eye, her innovative creativity, and a no-nonsense attitude that left little room for ego. Today, that attitude was being put to the test by a client named Mr. Albright, a man whose wealth was matched only by his condescending demeanor. He waved a dismissive hand at a set of blueprints spread across the conference table. "I'm not sure you're grasping the vision, Ms. Rivera," he said, his tone implying she was a simpleton. "I asked for grandeur, for a statement. This is just a building." Elena's team shifted uncomfortably, but she remained perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely on the table. She met his gaze without blinking. "Mr. Albright, the statement is in the subtlety of the design. The way the eastern facade captures the morning light, the seamless integration of the green roof, the cantilevered entrance that creates a sense of arrival without shouting. Grandeur isn't about size, it's about impact and intelligence. This design is intelligent." Her voice was calm, firm, and unshakable. She didn't raise it, didn't betray a hint of the annoyance simmering beneath the surface. She simply presented the facts, her professionalism a shield against his arrogance. He blinked, taken aback by her refusal to be cowed. After a moment of sputtering, he grudgingly conceded the point, turning his attention to a less significant detail. Elena had won, as she always did when confronted with baseless pomposity. She did not bend to arrogance. It was a rule she lived by. Later that afternoon, an invitation arrived on her desk. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the lettering embossed in gold foil. The annual Metropolitan Benefactors Gala, an event her firm was sponsoring. Elena sighed, turning the heavy invitation over in her hands. She viewed these functions as a necessary evil, a performance she had to endure for the sake of her career. It was a world of superficial smiles, calculated conversations, and men like Mr. Albright, all puffed up with their own importance. She found her fulfillment in the clean lines of a blueprint, in the challenge of turning a concept into a tangible structure. not in the hollow pursuit of social climbing, but her boss expected her to be there, to represent the firm, to network. And so, she would go. She would put on a beautiful dress, a charming smile, and play her part, all the while feeling a weary sense of detachment from the glittering, shallow world she was forced to navigate. The ballroom was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the clinking of champagne glasses, a soundtrack to the quiet hum of money and power. Elena, dressed in a simple but elegant emerald green gown that clung to her frame, circulated with a practiced grace. She made polite conversation with a city councilman, complimented the wife of a potential client on her diamond necklace, and managed to secure a follow-up meeting for one of her junior architects. She was good at this game of appearances, but every smile felt like a lie. As she was attempting a graceful exit from a conversation about yachting, she overheard a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. Dominic Caruso. The name rippled through the crowd. A stone dropped into a still pond. A mix of fear and awe colored the voices of those who spoke it. They said he was the king of the East Side, a man who had built an empire from the shadows, a man who owned everything and answered to no one. They said his arrival was unannounced, a power move in itself. Elena had no interest in Mafia gossip. The city was full of powerful men, and in her experience, they were all cut from the same arrogant cloth. Needing a respite from the suffocating atmosphere, she slipped through a set of French doors onto a wide, stone balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief. She wasn't alone. A man stood at the edge, his back to her, staring out at the glittering tapestry of the city. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit that couldn't quite disguise the raw power coiled in his shoulders and the formidable strength of his build. He turned as he heard the click of the door, and she found herself looking at the man from the whispers. He was handsome, but not in a soft, approachable way. His features were severe, his jaw sharp, his dark eyes holding an intimidating intensity. He held a glass of whiskey, which he gestured vaguely toward a large, abstract metal sculpture gleaming under a spotlight in the garden below. He spent over $1.5 million on that sculpture, the man said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. He hadn't introduced himself, simply assumed she was an audience for his pronouncement. For that price, you'd expect something that doesn't look like a pile of scrap metal. A casual, arrogant comment, expecting easy agreement. It was exactly the kind of dismissive remark that Elena detested. Unfortunately for him, she not only knew the artist, but deeply respected the challenging, provocative nature of the work. Without missing a beat, she replied, her voice clear and cool in the night air. "It's a bold piece," she stated, her eyes on the sculpture. "It requires a certain level of sophistication to appreciate, something that seems to be in short supply tonight." A sudden dead silence fell over the balcony. The few other people who had sought refuge out there froze, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips, their eyes wide with a terror that seemed wildly disproportionate to the conversation. Out of the corner of her eye, Elena saw two large men standing near the doors, men she hadn't noticed before, tense up, their bodies shifting into stances of coiled readiness. The man before her, Dominic Caruso, simply stared at her. His dark eyes were unreadable, giving away nothing. Elena felt a jolt of pure adrenaline, a potent cocktail of shock at her own audacity and a strange, unfamiliar thrill. She had spoken back to the king, and the court was holding its breath. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. A low chuckle escaped his lips, a rough, incredulous sound. It grew, rumbling up from his chest into a full, genuine laugh that echoed across the silent balcony. It was a rich, startling sound, completely at odds with the fear he so clearly inspired. The other guest looked on in stunned disbelief. He took a step toward her, the laughter subsiding into a wide, amused smile. "Finally," he said, his voice laced with genuine delight. someone brave enough to talk back. He extended a large, powerful hand. Dominic Caruso. The name confirmed her blunder. She had just insulted one of the most dangerous men in the city. But to show fear now would be to lose. Refusing to be intimidated, she completely ignored his outstretched hand, a deliberate and public slight. "Elena Rivera," she said, her chin held high. His smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. He held his hand there for a moment longer, a silent challenge, before slowly lowering it. The tension was a physical thing, a charged current in the space between them. Dominic's amusement was far more unsettling than anger would have been. It felt like a predator enjoying the spirit of its prey just before the chase began. Without another word, Elena turned and walked back into the cacophony of the gala, her back straight, her stride even. But she could feel his gaze on her, a tangible weight against her skin. It was not the casual glance of a man who had been dismissed. It was intense, possessive, and deeply unsettling. It was the look of a predator who had just found a fascinating new creature in a forest full of boring, predictable animals, and had decided with chilling certainty that he had to have it. The next morning, Elena's office felt different. The air, usually buzzing with the quiet efficiency of architectural design, was thick with a new kind of energy, a low hum of gossip that followed her from the moment she walked in. The story of her confrontation on the balcony had apparently traveled faster than the speed of light, whispered from one assistant to another, embellished with each telling until she was painted as either a suicidal fool or a modern-day folk hero. She ignored it, focusing on her work with a deliberate intensity, her screen a shield against the curious glances. The shield was shattered just before noon. A delivery man, struggling under the weight of his burden, appeared at the entrance to her department. He was wrestling with a floral arrangement so massive it was a spectacle. It wasn't a bouquet, it was a sculpture of flowers, a tidal wave of blood-red roses, so many that their velvety petals seemed to drink the light from the room. There must have been hundreds of them, their stems tightly bound to create a towering, opulent display of crimson. The scent, rich and overwhelmingly sweet, flooded the office, a cloying, fragrant invasion. The delivery man set the monstrosity down beside her desk, its sheer size a violation of her meticulously organized space. There was no card. There didn't need to be. Every single person in the office knew who it was from. Her colleagues, who had been pretending to work, were now openly staring, their faces a mixture of envy and awe. A junior designer let out a low whistle. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, hurried over, his eyes wide with a kind of reverent glee. "My goodness, Elena," he breathed, looking at the roses as if they were a holy relic. "Someone is certainly trying to get your attention. You need to be smart about this, Elena. Very smart." His words were a clear directive, a reminder that in his world, powerful benefactors were to be cultivated, not insulted. Elena's face was a mask of cold fury. This wasn't a gift. It was a statement, a public branding. He was marking his territory in front of her colleagues, using extravagance as a weapon to disrupt her professional life and turn her into a subject of gossip. It was a power play, as arrogant and unsubtle as his comment on the balcony. She would not have it. She turned to the delivery man, her voice perfectly calm. "Please take them back. There's been a mistake." The man looked panicked. "I can't do that, ma'am. My instructions were specific. Drop off only." "Then they are refused," Elena said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I still can't take them back," he stammered, sweating under the collective gaze of the office. Elena paused, her mind working quickly. She would not have this symbol of his possessiveness dominating her workspace. "Fine," she said, pulling out her phone. She found the number for the nearest city hospital. After a brief, efficient call, she turned back to the delivery man. "You can take them to the reception desk at Mount Sinai Hospital. They will be accepted there as a donation." A murmur went through the office. Her boss looked horrified, as if she had just set fire to a winning lottery ticket. But Elena felt a grim satisfaction. She had taken his grand public gesture and repurposed it, turning his intended display of power into an act of charity. She worked through the rest of the day, pointedly ignoring the mountain of roses that sat by the elevators, waiting to be picked up by a different courier. The air slowly cleared, the scent faded, and the office returned to a semblance of normalcy. Elena allowed herself to believe she had won the round. That evening, as she was locking her apartment door behind her, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart gave a sudden, hard jolt. With trembling fingers, she opened the message. "The sick and dying thank you, but I would have preferred you kept them. D." A chill, cold and sharp, snaked down her spine. It wasn't just a gift, it was a test, and he was watching her every move. He knew. He knew what she had done with the flowers, knew it almost as soon as it had happened. Her annoyance, which had been a hot, righteous fire, was now tinged with the cold, damp tendrils of genuine unease. This man's reach was longer and more invasive than she could have possibly imagined. Her sanctuary was a small hole-in-the-wall coffee shop, tucked away on a quiet side street, miles from the glitz of Midtown. It was a place of worn wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and the rich, comforting aroma of freshly ground espresso. The owner, a kind, elderly woman named Sophia, knew her order by heart, a double macchiato, and always had a quiet table for her in the back. It was the one place in the city Elena felt she could truly be herself, where the pressures of her career and the superficiality of the social world couldn't touch her. It was her haven, until today. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar little bell chiming above her, her eyes scanned the room for her usual spot. And then she saw him. He was sitting at a corner table, the very one she often favored, nursing a small cup of espresso. He wasn't in a suit. He wore a simple, dark gray cashmere sweater and black trousers. The casual, expensive clothes did nothing to soften his presence. If anything, they made him look more dangerous, like a panther stripped of its ceremonial trappings, revealing the raw, coiled muscle beneath. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes meeting hers across the room, and a slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He looked as if he belonged there, as if he had been waiting for her all along. The air in the small shop suddenly felt thin, charged. Sophia, behind the counter, looked from Dominic to Elena, her brow furrowed with confusion. Elena's first instinct was to turn and walk out, to deny him the satisfaction of this encounter. But that would be running, and she had already decided she would not run from him. Her sanctuary had been breached, and the only way to reclaim it was to face the invader. She walked to the counter, her back straight, acutely aware of his gaze following her every step. "The usual, Sophia," she said, her voice a little tighter than she would have liked. As Sophia prepared her coffee, Dominic rose from his table and approached her, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was unnerving. He stopped beside her at the counter, leaning against it casually, as if they were old friends meeting for a chat. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her ears alone. "I guess you have good taste in more than just art." Elena didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on Sophia's practiced movements. "I'm sure this is just a coincidence," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do you want, Mr. Caruso?" "I want to finish our conversation," he replied smoothly. "And I want you to call me Dominic." He gestured to her coffee, which Sophia had just placed on the counter. "Let me get that for you." "No, thank you," Elena said, placing a $10 bill on the counter before he could move. "I pay my own way." She picked up her macchiato, the ceramic cup warm in her cold hands. She finally turned to face him, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I have nothing more to say to you." She turned and walked toward the door, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire time. a physical pressure against her back. She didn't look back. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool afternoon air, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her haven was no longer safe. The city, which had once felt like her own sprawling, anonymous playground, was beginning to feel like his personal territory, and she was the fox in his hunt. That evening, the unease followed her home. As she approached her apartment building, a sleek black sedan she didn't recognize was parked at the curb, its engine idling silently. It was not Dominic's car. This one was different, somehow sharper, more overtly menacing. As she drew near, the passenger door opened and a man stepped out. He was handsome in a slick, polished way, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it cost more than her first car, a vibrant blue that was just a little too loud. He leaned against the car, blocking her path to the building's entrance. "Elena Rivera," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an undercurrent of something cruel. "It's a pleasure. I'm Marco Varelli, a business associate of Dominic's." The name meant nothing to her, but the title, business associate, sent another chill through her. This was Dominic's world, reaching out to touch her once again. "I don't know you," Elena said, clutching her purse strap tightly. "And I'm not interested in Mr. Caruso's associates. Please get out of my way." Marco's cruel smile widened. He made no move to let her pass. "Oh, I think you should be interested," he said, his tone mockingly friendly. "I'm here to offer some advice, woman to man, so to speak. Dominic, he has a certain reputation. He likes new things, shiny things, but he gets bored easily, and when he gets bored of his toys, he breaks them." He let his eyes trail down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "A pretty thing like you should be careful. You wouldn't want to get broken, would you?" This was different from Dominic's veiled threats and possessive gestures. This was a direct, ugly threat, delivered with a smug, predatory leer. This man, Marco, was not playing a game of obsession. He was staking a claim in a war she didn't understand. The encounter introduced an external, unpredictable danger that raised the stakes exponentially. It was no longer just about Dominic's personal fixation on her. She was now on the radar of his enemies, a piece on a board she couldn't even see. For the first time, Elena felt a surge of genuine, gut-wrenching fear. This was real. This was dangerous. Her defiance was still there, a hard knot in her stomach, but it was now laced with the cold, sharp tang of terror. A few nights later, Elena was working late, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of blueprints and project timelines. She left the office well after dark, the streets of the financial district mostly deserted, the towering skyscrapers dark and silent. The air was cold, and she pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked the short block to the parking garage where she left her car. The rhythmic click of her heels on the pavement was the only sound in the empty street. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows of a recessed doorway. He moved with a silent, startling speed, covering the distance between them in a few fluid strides. Before she could even scream, he had her, his body pressing her back against the cold, rough brick of a building wall. Her heart leaped into her throat, a wild, panicked bird. It was Dominic. He wasn't amused anymore. The playful, predatory glint she had seen at the gala and the coffee shop was gone, replaced by a dark, frightening intensity. His hands were on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. He was furious, but she could see it wasn't directed at her. "He won't bother you again," Dominic said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "No one will." He knew. Of course, he knew about Marco's visit. The thought that she was being watched so closely, that the details of her life were being reported back to this man, was terrifying. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "Leave me alone," she whispered, the plea sounding weak even to her own ears. "I want nothing to do with you. I want nothing to do with your world." He leaned in closer, his body a wall of heat and strength. His breath was warm against her ear as his voice dropped to a possessive whisper, a sound that sent a shiver of both fear and something else, something she refused to name, through her entire body. "It's too late for that," he murmured, the words a solemn vow. "You talked back to me, remember? You stood on that balcony and you looked the devil in the eye and you didn't flinch. Now you have my full attention. Elena." He moved one hand from the wall, his touch surprisingly gentle as he traced the line of her jaw with the pad of his thumb, his skin rough against hers. She flinched but didn't pull away, mesmerized by the dark fire in his eyes. "And I meant what I said," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, a husky, intimate promise that sealed her fate. "I'm going to make you eat every single one of those words you spoke to me, one kiss at a time." The threat was no longer a game. It was a deeply personal, intimate declaration of intent. This was the turning point, the moment the pursuit became a claim of possession. He held her gaze for a long, breathless moment, the entire world seeming to shrink to the space between their bodies, charged with a terrifying, undeniable pull. Then, as quickly and silently as he had appeared, he was gone. He stepped back into the shadows and vanished, leaving her breathless and shaken, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. She was trapped, caught between her fear of him and a horrifying magnetic pull toward the very intensity that threatened to consume her. The weeks that followed were a master class in psychological warfare. Elena felt as though she were living inside a drum, the constant low-level vibration of Dominic's presence resonating through every aspect of her life. He didn't send more flowers. He didn't text. The silence was, in its own way, more unnerving than the pursuit. It was the quiet of a predator that knows its prey is cornered, the patient stillness before the final pounce. At work, she threw herself into her projects with a desperate fervor, the clean, logical lines of architectural plans a welcome antidote to the chaotic uncertainty of her personal life. Then the project landed. It was the kind of opportunity that architects dream of, a career-defining commission that would be spoken about for decades. A newly formed development corporation, backed by a mysterious and obscenely wealthy investor, wanted to build a new luxury hotel complex on the waterfront, a staggering architectural statement that would reshape the city's skyline. Every major firm had vied for it, and against all odds, Elena's team had won. The news sent a wave of euphoria through the office. Mr. Henderson was practically levitating with joy, and he announced at a firm-wide meeting that Elena, his star project manager, would be leading the design and execution. For a fleeting moment, Elena felt a surge of pure, unadulterated professional pride. This was everything she had worked for. This was the validation of her talent, her dedication, her entire life's focus. She would be in charge of a legacy project. The kickoff meeting was held in their largest conference room, the one with the panoramic view of the very skyline they were about to alter. The representatives from the development corporation were there, a team of sharp-suited lawyers and executives. But the principal investor, the source of the project's limitless funding, had yet to arrive. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the room. Mr. Henderson kept smoothing his tie, his face flushed with excitement. The door opened and the room fell silent. Dominic Caruso walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. He moved to the head of the table, his dark eyes sweeping the room before they landed, with unnerving precision, on Elena. A slow, triumphant smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a chess master who had just said, "Checkmate." Elena's blood ran cold. The euphoria of a moment ago curdled into a thick, nauseating horror. It was a trap. A gilded, career-making, inescapable trap. Her project, her triumph, her legacy, it was all his. He had not just invaded her personal life, he had now conquered her professional one, binding her to him with contracts and ambition. Mr. Henderson, oblivious, rushed forward to shake Dominic's hand, babbling about vision and partnership. Elena just sat there, frozen, the blueprints in front of her blurring into meaningless lines. He had bought her. After the meeting, as the room cleared out, leaving the lingering scent of expensive cologne and shattered dreams, Elena remained in her seat. Dominic dismissed his associates with a flick of his wrist, his eyes never leaving her. When they were alone, the silence in the vast conference room was deafening. She finally found her voice, rising from her chair to face him across the polished expanse of the table. "This is insane," she said, her voice low and shaking with a rage so profound it made her dizzy. "This is my project, my career. You can't just buy my career." He remained perfectly relaxed, leaning back in his chair, the picture of a man in total control. "I'm not buying it, Elena," he said, his tone infuriatingly reasonable. "I'm investing in it. I told you on the balcony, I appreciate good taste. Your firm's proposal was, by a significant margin, the best. Your vision is exceptional." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now I get to see you work every day. I get to watch you create. Consider it a perk of being my partner." "We are not partners," she hissed. "We are now," he said simply, his smile gone, his expression one of absolute certainty. "You're the lead architect. I'm the client. You can't quit, not without torpedoing your career and your firm. You're trapped, Elena. The only way out is through me." He had cornered her completely, using her own ambition, the very thing that defined her, as the bars of her cage. Her anger was a white-hot, impotent inferno, but beneath it was the cold, heavy stone of utter helplessness. The construction site was a chaotic skeleton of steel and concrete, a stark contrast to the polished world of the office. Elena found a strange solace there, especially late at night, when the crews had gone home and the massive structure was a silent, sleeping giant under the moon. She was there for a late-night site inspection, walking the unfinished floors with a powerful flashlight, her hard hat on, her mind focused on load-bearing walls and electrical conduits. It was a tangible world, a world she understood. She was on the 3rd floor, examining the framing for the future ballroom, when she heard a noise from below. Not the familiar groan of settling steel, but the crunch of gravel, followed by hushed, ugly laughter. A prickle of unease went down her neck. She crept to the edge of the unfinished floor, peering down into the darkness. A group of 4 large, thuggish men were walking toward the base of the structure, carrying crowbars and cans of spray paint. They weren't a work crew. Her heart began to hammer. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Before she could dial, she heard one of them speak, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Marco said to make a mess, and to have some fun with the pretty architect if she's still here. They knew she was here. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. They were Marco Varelli's men. They were here for her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was trapped, 3 floors up in a concrete skeleton. She scrambled backward, away from the edge, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear them entering the structure below, their heavy boots echoing on the concrete. Just as one of them spotted her flashlight beam and shouted, a black car screeched to a halt at the edge of the site, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Doors flew open and figures emerged, moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency. It was Dominic and his men. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. Elena didn't see everything, hiding behind a stack of drywall, but she saw enough. She saw shadows moving with a lethal grace that was nothing like the powerful businessman she knew. She heard the sickening, wet thud of fists hitting flesh, a choked-off cry, and then a chilling silence. It was brutal, swift, and utterly soundless. Dominic himself moved like a phantom, a blur of controlled violence that was more terrifying than any wild brawl. He dispatched 2 of the men himself, his movements economical and deadly. Within a minute, it was over. The thugs were dealt with, dragged away by Dominic's men, and loaded into a van that disappeared as silently as it had arrived. they were not left for the police. Dominic turned, his silhouette framed by the distant city lights. He walked toward her, his footsteps the only sound in the vast, echoing space. He was physically unharmed, but as he stepped into the weak light from her flashlight, she saw the dark fire blazing in his eyes. It was the look of a killer. He stopped in front of her, and the monster she had just witnessed vanished, replaced by the concerned man. His gaze softened as he looked at her, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. She shook her head, unable to speak. He reached out, his touch surprisingly gentle as he brushed a smudge of dust from her cheek. "This is why you need me, Elena," he said softly, his voice a low, intense rumble. "This world, their world, it doesn't play by your rules." It was a pivotal, terrifying moment of clarity. She had just seen the monster, the brutal reality of the world he inhabited. But the monster had just saved her. The abstract danger Marco represented had become terrifyingly concrete, and Dominic's protection was just as real. She felt a confusing, sickening mix of revulsion at his brutality and a deep primal sense of security in his presence. He was the fire, but he was also the only shield against it. Elena met her friend Maria at a small, anonymous café in a neighborhood far from her usual spots, a place she hoped was beyond the reach of Dominic's surveillance. Maria, a sharp-witted journalist with an allergy to nonsense, took one look at Elena's pale face and the dark circles under her eyes, and knew something was seriously wrong. "Okay, spill it," Maria said, stirring her latte. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Elena tried to downplay it, to frame it as a problem with an overly aggressive client, but the words felt hollow and false. She couldn't bring herself to describe the violence at the construction site, the cold efficiency in Dominic's eyes. How could she explain a world so far removed from their reality of deadlines and bad dates? But Maria was too smart. "Elena, I read the society pages for work. I know who you insulted at that gala, and I know who your firm's new mystery client is. This isn't about an aggressive client, is it? This is about Dominic Caruso." Elena flinched at the name. She looked down at her hands, wrapped around her cooling cup of tea. "It's complicated, Maria. Complicated." Maria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a serious, urgent whisper. "Elena, this isn't a romance novel. This man is not some brooding, misunderstood hero. He's a gangster, a killer. People who get close to men like that, they don't just get their hearts broken. They get hurt. They disappear." The stark, brutal truth of Maria's words hung in the air. Everything she said was right. It was what Elena's own logical mind had been screaming at her for weeks. But then, the image of the thugs cornering her, the memory of the raw fear, rose in her mind, followed by the image of Dominic, standing like a dark guardian between her and them. "He protected me," Elena heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. She was shocked to hear them, shocked by the defensive tone in her own voice. Something happened. There were men. They were going to hurt me, and he stopped them. Maria stared at her, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Oh, Elena, don't you see? That's how it starts. He creates the storm and then sells you the umbrella. He puts you in danger or allows you to be in danger, just so he can be the one to save you. It makes you dependent. It makes you grateful." Elena wanted to argue, to say that it was Marco's men, that Dominic had saved her from his rival. But as she opened her mouth, she realized how insane it sounded. She was parsing the motivations of rival mafia bosses as if it were a normal part of her life. Maria's concern, her clear-eyed view of the situation, only served to highlight how much Elena's own perspective had already shifted, how warped her sense of normal had become. She felt a profound sense of isolation. The one person she could normally confide in, the one person who could ground her, couldn't possibly understand the complexity of her situation. She was truly alone in this, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Dominic insisted on driving her home after the incident at the construction site. His large armored car moved silently through the city streets, a bubble of tense quiet. Elena stared out the window, the flashing lights of the city a meaningless blur. She was still shaken, the adrenaline having given way to a deep, trembling exhaustion. Dominic was watching her, she could feel it. His expression, when she dared to glance at him, was unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. He didn't drive her all the way to her building. He pulled over to the curb a block away, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, charged. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like a betrayal of every principle she held, an admission of her reliance on him. "For what you did." He turned his body toward her in the driver's seat. "I will always protect you, Elena," he said, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of steel. It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of fact. He didn't move. He just sat there, watching her, his dark eyes searching her face. The space between them crackled with unspoken energy. He was waiting. After everything, the pursuit, the threats, the rescue, he was giving her a choice, a silent, terrifying choice. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind, screaming at her to get out of the car, to run, to fight. But her body was frozen, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze. Slowly, deliberately, he began to lean in. She didn't pull away. The kiss was not what she expected. It wasn't brutal or demanding or angry. It was a test. It was firm, his lips claiming hers with a possessiveness that sent a shockwave through her system. But it was also questioning, a silent inquiry into the defenses she had so fiercely maintained. It was the fulfillment of his dark promise, a punishment that felt terrifyingly like a reward. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark and intense, searching hers for a reaction, for a sign that he had broken through. She was left breathless, her lips tingling, her mind a complete blank. She was confused and terrified, and horrified by the small, treacherous part of her that hadn't wanted it to end. Dominic's gaze held hers for a long moment, and then the corner of his mouth lifted in a slow, knowing smile. "That's one," he said softly. On the pretense of surveying a potential acquisition, a small parcel of land for a community give-back project he claimed the city planners would appreciate, Dominic drove her out of the glittering canyons of Manhattan. They crossed a bridge into the Bronx, the landscape shifting dramatically. The sleek glass and steel towers gave way to brick tenements and low, sprawling warehouses, their walls a vibrant tapestry of graffiti. The air itself seemed to change, losing its scent of perfume and exhaust, replaced by the smells of roasting pork from a street vendor and the faint, sweet aroma of a bakery. This was a different city, one with a pulse that beat closer to the pavement. He was taking her to the neighborhood where he grew up. He parked the formidable car on a street lined with old, proud brownstones, their stoops occupied by people talking and laughing in a mixture of English and rapid musical Italian. Here, no one gave his expensive vehicle a second glance. They looked at him, and they smiled. A group of kids playing stickball in the street paused to shout, "Dom!" and he raised a hand in acknowledgement, a faint, genuine smile touching his own lips. Elena watched this transformation in stunned silence. The formidable, intimidating Mafia boss, the man who commanded fear with a glance, was fading away, replaced by someone else entirely. He led her to a small, unassuming storefront with a faded green awning that read Rossi's Pasticceria. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of sugar, almonds, and baking bread. An elderly woman with flour dusting her apron and her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun looked up from behind the counter. Her wrinkled face broke into a radiant smile. "Domenico!" she cried, her voice thick with an Italian accent. She bustled around the counter and enveloped him in a hug, patting his cheek with a flowery hand. He spoke to her in fluent Italian, his voice softer, his entire demeanor relaxed in a way Elena had never seen. He was not Dominic Caruso, the king of the East Side. Here, he was just Dom, the boy who used to steal biscotti when her back was turned. He bought 2 cannolis, freshly filled, and 2 small cups of espresso. He led Elena to a tiny table by the window. He handed her one of the pastries, his fingers brushing hers, a touch that felt strangely intimate in this wholesome setting. "My mother," he said, his voice quiet, his gaze distant as he looked out at the familiar street. "She used to say you could solve most of life's problems with a good cannoli and a strong coffee." He took a bite of the pastry, a crumb of powdered sugar clinging to his lip. She was wrong, of course. Some problems require different solutions. He met Elena's eyes, and for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of something ancient and sad in their depths. But it's nice to pretend sometimes. It was the most he had ever revealed of himself. A tiny, calculated crack in his armor. Elena knew it was a performance, another strategic move in his campaign to own her. But the emotion behind it, the memory of a lost mother and a simpler time, felt undeniably real. It didn't excuse the man he had become, the violence he commanded, or the fear he inspired. But it began to explain him. It made him human. And that, she realized with a jolt of panic, was far more dangerous for her heart than the monster she had imagined him to be. The fragile truce forged over pastries shattered the moment they were back in the car, crossing the bridge back into the world he now ruled. His phone buzzed, and he answered it, his voice instantly losing its softness, becoming hard and clipped. He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I'm on my way," he said, and ended the call. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden return of the cold, dangerous aura that was his natural state. They drove the rest of the way in a tense, heavy silence. He didn't take her to her apartment. Instead, he pulled up in front of a towering, impossibly sleek residential skyscraper in the heart of the city. A building so new it wasn't yet fully occupied. His head of security, a stoic, broad-shouldered man named Luca, whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, was waiting for them at the curb. He opened Elena's door, his expression impassive. "What is this?" Elena demanded, looking at Dominic. "This isn't my home." "It is now," Dominic said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Luca spoke, his voice as impassive as his face. "Ms. Rivera, we have credible intelligence that Marco Varelli no longer intends to intimidate you. His plan is to take you. He wants to use you as leverage against Mr. Caruso." Elena stared at him, her blood running cold. To take her. The words echoed in the terrifying space that had opened up in her mind. "No," she said, shaking her head, turning back to Dominic, a surge of defiant fury rising to fight the fear. "No, this is my life. That is my home. You can't just force me out." "I'm not asking," Dominic said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He got out of the car and stood before her, a mountain of implacable will. "I am ensuring your safety. Your apartment is compromised. Your life is in direct danger. You will stay here, where I can protect you." The choice was stripped from her as cleanly as if it had been surgically removed. Her apartment, her sanctuary, her last bastion of independence, was gone. While she stood frozen on the sidewalk, a team of movers, his men, were already at her old building, packing her life into boxes with cold efficiency. She was moved that same day, escorted up to a penthouse apartment that occupied the entire top floor. It was breathtaking. The walls were glass, offering a 360-degree view of the city she loved. A glittering panorama of light and life. The furniture was modern and luxurious. The kitchen was a chef's dream. The bathroom was a marble spa. It was a palace in the sky. And it was a prison. The feeling of being caged was now terrifyingly literal. She had every luxury, every comfort. A view that people would kill for, but the doors were guarded, the elevators were controlled, and she was a captive. Her anger and resentment were a burning inferno in her chest. But beneath them, for the first time, was the cold, sharp, undeniable reality of her fear. She was his. That night, she paced the vast, silent living room like a caged panther. The city lights spread out below her, a beautiful, mocking reminder of the freedom she had lost. She heard the private elevator chime and knew it was him. The doors slid open, and Dominic stepped into the apartment, shrugging out of his suit jacket. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp as he took in the sight of her body vibrating with rage. "I hate you," she said, the words tearing from her throat, raw and visceral. She stalked toward him, her fists clenched at her sides. "I hate what you've done to my life. You've taken everything from me." "I am keeping you alive," he countered, his voice low and tight. He threw his jacket onto a sterile white sofa. "Is your pride more important than your life?" "My freedom is," she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This isn't protection, it's possession. I am not one of your things, Dominic." The argument was heated, passionate, a storm of rage and fear that had been building for weeks. He moved toward her, and she didn't back down. She met him in the center of the room, her chest heaving. He cornered her again, but this time she fought back, pushing against his chest with all her might. It was a fiery, desperate struggle, a physical manifestation of the war being waged within her. He was stronger, of course, and he backed her up step by step until her back was pressed against the cold, unyielding glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled beneath them like a fallen constellation. The fight, the raw, desperate energy, suddenly dissolved into something else. The space between them became thick, charged, every rational thought consumed by the storm of emotion. His hands came up to cage her head, his thumbs stroking her flushed cheeks, and then his mouth was on hers. This kiss was not gentle. It was not a test. It was a clash of wills, a battle for control. It was hungry, angry, and desperate on both their parts, filled with all the rage, fear, and undeniable chemistry that had been arcing between them from the very beginning. It was a kiss of fury and surrender, of hatred and a terrifying, magnetic need. It was a battle that neither of them won, a raw confession of the hold they had on each other. When he finally broke away, they were both breathless, shaken. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. Elena's mind, which had been screaming in protest, was now utterly silent. In that silence, a devastating truth bloomed. Her feelings for this man were not just fear. They were not just resentment. There was a powerful, consuming, magnetic attraction that she could no longer deny, not even to herself. The kiss had not been a violation. It had been a surrender, and she was terrified to realize that a part of her had surrendered willingly. The days that followed were a strange, tense limbo. The gilded cage became a fortress, and Elena its solitary, restless prisoner. Dominic, citing the ongoing threat, had forbidden her from leaving for any reason. A trip to the office, even for a critical project meeting, was deemed too risky. He arranged for secure video conferencing, for blueprints to be delivered by armed courier. He had effectively severed her from her life, leaving her with nothing but time and the four glass walls of her prison. The ambush came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dominic had finally, reluctantly, approved a site visit. The project was at a critical phase, and certain structural decisions had to be made in person. The security preparations were immense. The plan was for Luca to escort her in an armored car, with a decoy vehicle and a follow car full of his men. The parking garage beneath the penthouse was a fortress in itself, with guards and security checkpoints. It was supposed to be the safest place in the city. As Luca held the car door open for her in the echoing concrete expanse of the garage, all hell broke loose. A black van, which had been parked innocuously in a corner, suddenly roared to life, its tires squealing as it sped toward them, ramming into the lead decoy car and blocking the exit ramp. Simultaneously, men in black tactical gear rappelled down from the ceiling, a shocking military-style assault. It was chaos. Gunshots, muffled by silencers, echoed through the garage. Luca shoved Elena behind the armored car, drawing his own weapon. "Stay down," he yelled, his face a mask of grim focus as he returned fire. In the terrifying confusion, Elena saw one of the attackers break through the line, moving with a deadly purpose directly toward her. Luca saw him too. He moved to intercept, putting his body between Elena and the threat. There was a sickening grunt, and Luca staggered, a dark stain spreading across his side. He went down on one knee, still trying to raise his weapon. Panic, cold, and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. But then something else took over. Adrenaline, sharp and clear, cut through the fear. She was not a victim. She was an architect. She knew buildings. As Dominic had walked her through the security of the penthouse, he had shown her the blueprints, boasting about its impenetrable design. An image flashed in her mind, a detail she had noted with professional interest, a service tunnel connecting the residential parking to the commercial levels, hidden behind an unmarked steel door. "Luca!" she screamed, grabbing his arm. He was bleeding heavily, but his eyes were still clear. "This way," she half dragged, half supported him, her own strength surprising her. She found the door, just as she remembered, and threw her weight against it. It was unlocked. They stumbled into a dark, narrow corridor. The sounds of the firefight instantly muffled. Using the light from her phone, she navigated the dusty, pipeline tunnel, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found a maintenance stairwell and helped Luca up 2 flights, his breathing growing more ragged with every step. They emerged into a deserted hallway in the building's empty commercial wing. She got him into an empty office, barricading the door with a heavy desk. Only then, when he was relatively safe, did she pull out her phone, her fingers slick with a mixture of her own sweat and Luca's blood. She dialed Dominic's number. He answered on the first ring. "They got us," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "In the garage. Luca's hit. But we're out. We're safe. For now." The training wheels were off. She was no longer a passive pawn in his game. She had been hunted in his world, and she had used her own skills, her own intelligence, to survive. The incident solidified her place in the conflict. She was not just a prize to be won or protected. She was a target, and as she had just proven to herself and to the most dangerous man she had ever known, she was also a player. The penthouse doors burst open with such force they slammed against the interior walls, the sound cracking through the tense silence like a gunshot. Dominic stood there, a figure of pure, cold fury. His eyes, black and depthless, swept the room, passing over his own men, who were already tending to Luca, and landing on Elena. He moved toward her, his stride long and predatory, ignoring everything and everyone else. The air crackled around him, thick with a terrifying, controlled rage. He stopped directly in front of her, his sheer presence a suffocating force. His hands came up not to touch her, but to hover inches from her skin as his gaze roamed over her. A frantic, desperate search for injury. He saw the smear of blood on her cheek, the spatter on her blouse, and his jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped. "Is it yours?" he asked, his voice a low, guttural growl that was more terrifying than any shout. Elena shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. "It's Luca's." Only then did his gaze flicker to his wounded man. He gave a series of clipped, precise orders to the men surrounding Luca, his voice the epitome of command. A medic was on the way. The floor was being secured. The building was in total lockdown. Then he turned his full, undivided attention back to Elena. He reached out, his touch shockingly gentle, and tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing away the drying blood on her cheek. His eyes found a small, shallow scratch on her arm, a thin red line where a piece of flying debris must have caught her. He led her into the vast marble bathroom without a word. He sat her down on the edge of the tub and opened a mirrored cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit. His movements were economical and precise as he cleaned the small cut, his large, powerful hands displaying a surgeon's delicacy. The intimacy of the act, in the midst of the chaotic aftermath of a gunfight, was jarring. He was a killer, a man who commanded violence, yet he was tending to her smallest injury with a focus that felt like a prayer. The scent of the antiseptic was sharp, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood that still lingered in the air. "You were brave," he said, his voice soft now, but still vibrating with that intense, underlying fury. He smoothed a bandage over the cut, his fingers lingering on her skin for a moment longer than necessary. "You saved my best man." The praise felt strange, alien. "I'm not one of your soldiers, Dominic," she whispered. The words a faint protest against the reality that was closing in on her. He looked up, his dark eyes locking with hers. The rage was still there, but it was banked, overshadowed by something else, something fiercely protective and deeply personal. "No," he said, his voice dropping to an intense murmur. "You're not. You're much more important." He stood, pulling her to her feet. He led her out of the bathroom and back into the living room, where Luca was now being carefully loaded onto a gurney by a team of private medics. Dominic paused, placing a hand on Luca's shoulder, the two men sharing a look of complete, unspoken understanding. Then, Dominic turned to face the rest of his men, his expression hardening into a mask of cold death. "This was Marco," he stated. Not a question, but a declaration. "He crossed a line. He brought the war to my home. He tried to take what is mine." His gaze flickered to Elena, a brief possessive fire that made her shiver. "There are no more rules. There is no more business. This is total war. I want him found. I want his entire organization dismantled, piece by piece. I want him erased." The orders were delivered in a low, lethal tone that left no doubt as to the outcome. He was unleashing the full, terrifying extent of his power, and Elena knew with a chilling certainty that she was the reason. The dynamic had shifted. He no longer saw her as a fascinating prey to be conquered, but as a partner, a queen to be protected in his kingdom. And in his eyes, she saw not just the monster who commanded death, but the fierce, unwavering protector whose entire world was now focused on her. The penthouse, once a symbol of her imprisonment, became a shared captivity. The days that followed bled into one another, a strange, surreal period of forced domesticity, set against the backdrop of a brewing war. Elena was on total lockdown. The glass walls that had once felt like a cage now felt like the only thing separating her from the violent world outside. Dominic stayed with her. He did not leave the penthouse, transforming the minimalist living space into a command center. Laptops and encrypted phones covered the long dining table. Maps of the city were spread across the floor, marked with red ink. His most trusted men came and went, their faces grim, their reports delivered in low, urgent tones. Elena became a ghost in her own prison, a silent observer of his deadly kingdom. She watched him work, saw the immense pressure he was under. She saw him on the phone, his voice calm and decisive as he made decisions that she knew had life or death consequences. He would pace for hours, a caged lion of his own making, the weight of his world etched onto his face. They existed in the same space, sharing meals in a tense silence, their paths crossing in the long hallways. They argued, of course, their strong wills clashing over her confinement, over the life he was forcing upon her. But the arguments lacked their earlier fire, replaced by a weary resignation. This was their reality now. In these strange, shared moments, the walls between them, so carefully constructed of anger and fear, began to crumble. She saw past the Mafia boss, past the intimidating facade, and saw the man, a man burdened by power, isolated by the very fear he inspired. One night, long after his men had left, she found him standing before the vast window, staring out at the glittering, indifferent city. He hadn't heard her approach. The weight on his shoulders seemed immense, a physical thing that bowed his powerful frame. He looked utterly alone. Without a word, Elena went to the bar, poured a measure of his favorite whiskey into a heavy crystal glass, and brought it to him. She held it out. He turned, his expression surprised, and looked from the glass to her face. He took it from her, their fingers brushing. A small spark in the quiet darkness. It was a gesture of truce, of understanding, a white flag in their personal war. He took a slow sip, the silence stretching between them, no longer tense, but companionable. "The view from the top," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, "is empty." He admitted it not as a complaint, but as a simple, weary fact. It was a confession of the profound loneliness of his position, a glimpse into the hollow core of his power. A reluctant empathy stirred within her. It was a dangerous, treacherous feeling. This man had destroyed her life, trapped her, terrified her. But in this moment, he was not the monster. He was just a man, isolated by his own choices, and she was the only person in the world who was seeing it. The monster was easy to hate, easy to fight. The man was not. The man was getting under her skin, finding the cracks in her armor, and she was terrified she was beginning to feel something for him. The conversation happened late one night. A few days later, the war outside was escalating. A violent, unseen storm she only heard in the clipped, brutal phone calls Dominic made. They were in the living room, the city lights a silent, glittering audience. The tension that had been simmering between them for days had finally reached a boiling point. But it was a quiet, intense heat, not a raging fire. Elena had been staring out the window, tracing the path of a boat on the dark river below, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. She turned to face him where he sat on the sofa, a file open on his lap, though he wasn't reading it. "What happens when this is over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence of the room. "If you win, if Marco is gone, what happens to me? Do I just go back to my life and pretend none of this happened? Pretend you never happened?" The questions were a plea, a desperate need for an answer to a future she couldn't even begin to imagine. Dominic closed the file and placed it on the table. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering, stripping away all pretense. "There is no after for us that is separate, Elena," he said, his voice low and certain. "You see that now, don't you? There is no going back to your old life. It doesn't exist anymore." His words were brutal in their honesty, but she knew they were true. Her old life, her carefully constructed world of blueprints and professional ambition, had been burned to the ground. She was standing in the ashes, and he was the only other person there. He didn't move toward her. He didn't try to touch her or persuade her. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his expression unreadable but for the raw intensity in his eyes. He was giving her a choice, the most important one of her life. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of everything that had happened between them. This was it, the final wall. Elena's heart was hammering, a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. Her mind screamed at her, a chorus of her old self, the independent woman who bowed to no one, telling her to run, to demand her freedom, to hate this man who had taken it from her. But her body, her soul, was tired of fighting. It was tired of the fear, the anger, the loneliness. It craved the security she felt in his presence, the terrifying thrill of his intensity, the reluctant empathy that had grown in the quiet moments of their shared captivity. Slowly, as if moving through water, she walked toward him. She stopped directly in front of him, her knees almost touching his. He didn't move, his eyes searching hers, waiting. This time, the choice had to be hers. The surrender had to be hers. She reached up, her hands trembling slightly, and cupped his face. His skin was rough beneath her palms. She leaned down, closing the final distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. This kiss was not a claim or a battle. It was acceptance. It was a deep, soul-shattering confession. It was her acknowledging the undeniable truth of her feelings, the irreversible reality of her situation. It was a surrender, not to him, but to the powerful, undeniable connection that bound them together. The kiss was passionate and deep, a desperate, hungry meeting of two people who had found an anchor in the midst of a raging storm. It changed everything. It was the point of no return, and as his arms came around her, pulling her down onto his lap, holding her as if he would never let her go, she knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that she never wanted him to. The break in the war came a week later. Dominic's men, through a brutal but effective campaign of dismantling Marco's operations, had captured one of his key lieutenants, a man named Rico. The interrogation took place in a secure location far from the penthouse, a fact for which Elena was grateful. She didn't need to see the violence to know it was happening. She could see it in the cold, hard set of Dominic's jaw when he returned, in the grim satisfaction in his eyes. He found her in the study, where she'd been trying to lose herself in the architectural plans for the hotel, a project that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. He came and stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his presence a familiar, solid weight. "We know his plan," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He explained what they had learned from Rico. Marco was no longer trying to get to Elena. The ambush in the garage had been a failure, and he knew Dominic's fortress was now impenetrable. So he had changed tactics. He was trying to lure Dominic out. He was using Elena not as a physical hostage, but as a psychological one. Marco had watched Dominic's obsession grow, had seen how he had upended his own life to protect her. He believed Dominic's feelings for her were his greatest weakness, a fatal flaw that he could exploit. "He's going to stage a threat against something you care about," Dominic continued, his hands tightening on her shoulders. "Something from your old life, your office, a friend. He's going to make it look like he can still reach you, to force me to come out into the open where he thinks he can trap me." Dominic realized then that this would never end. Marco would never stop until one of them was dead. As long as they were both alive, Elena would always be a target, a pawn in their deadly game. He began to pace the room, his mind working, a dangerous plan forming in his eyes. A plan to end it, once and for all. He stopped in front of her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "I can end this," he said, "but it's dangerous. It will require him to believe he has finally succeeded. It will require him to believe he has you." He paused, his gaze boring into hers, searching for any hint of doubt, of fear. "I need you to trust me, Elena, completely, with your life. Can you do that?" She looked at him, at this man who had been her captor, her protector, her enemy, and now her everything. The man she now realized, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, she was falling for. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by something far more powerful, her trust in him. She had already surrendered her heart. What was her life? She rose from her chair and stood before him, a partner, an equal. She nodded, her decision absolute. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I trust you." The plan was a masterpiece of deception, elegant in its complexity and brutal in its intent. It moved into motion with the chilling precision of a well-oiled machine. Using calculated misinformation fed through a double agent they had turned within Marco's organization, Dominic's team painted a picture of a security lapse, a moment of vulnerability. They created a narrative that Elena, suffering from extreme cabin fever, had insisted on a private late-night visit to her old office to retrieve personal items. A sentimental and foolish move. The bait was the illusion of her weakness, the believable crack in Dominic's fortress. Marco, blinded by his own arrogance and his belief that Dominic had been weakened by love, took it completely. He believed he had his prize, the ultimate leverage to bring his rival to his knees. But Elena was not in her old office. She was miles away, hidden in a secure overwatch position in a nondescript commercial building across the river, overlooking the desolate warehouse district where the final act would play out. The room was dark, lit only by the cold blue glow of multiple monitors displaying feeds from hidden cameras. Luca, his side heavily bandaged but his eyes as sharp and steady as ever, sat beside her, a silent, reassuring presence. This had been her condition for agreeing to the plan, her one non-negotiable demand. She would not be a helpless pawn. She would not be locked away while her fate was decided. She would be a witness. She had a communications link, a direct, open line to Dominic. Her earpiece a fragile thread connecting her to him across the dark water. She watched on one of the screens as Dominic's car, the same armored sedan she knew so well, pulled up to the designated meeting point, a lonely pier jutting out into the Black River. He got out, and her heart clenched. He looked utterly defeated. His shoulders were slumped, his movements slow, his face a mask of despair. He was playing his part perfectly, appearing alone, broken, a king coming to beg for the return of his queen. He was walking into the lion's den for her. The tension in the small, dark room was immense, a physical weight that pressed down on Elena, making it hard to breathe. She had placed her life, her future, her entire world into the hands of this dangerous, complicated man. Her hand rested on the cool metal of the console, her knuckles white. She had never felt so terrified or so completely certain. The main monitor showed the interior of the designated warehouse, a vast, decaying cavern of rust and shadows. Marco Varelli stood in the center, flanked by his men, basking in the glow of his perceived victory. He was preening, a smug, triumphant smile on his face as Dominic was led inside, his hands held out in a gesture of surrender. "Dominic, Dominic, Dominic," Marco said, circling him like a vulture. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you, this weakness, this sentimentality." He gestured around the empty warehouse. "Where is she, you ask? Oh, she's safe, for now, but her comfort depends entirely on you." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. "She was your weakness, Dominic. I knew it the moment I saw her. Love, it's a poison. It rots men like us from the inside out. It makes us soft, predictable." Elena watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw Dominic's performance, the way his eyes were downcast, the way his body radiated defeat. He was a master actor. "Just let me see her, Marco," Dominic pleaded, his voice rough with manufactured anguish. "Let me know she's safe. Then we can talk about whatever you want. The territories, the businesses, it's all yours." Marco laughed, a loud, ugly sound that echoed in the cavernous space. He was savoring his triumph, letting his guard down just as Dominic had predicted. "You see," he said to his men, the great Dominic Caruso, brought to his knees by a pretty face. It was then that Dominic lifted his head, his eyes finding the hidden camera he knew was there. The camera that fed directly to Elena's screen. He looked directly at her, and then he spoke, his voice clear and steady over the open comms link, a message meant only for her. "Tell Elena," he said, his voice resonating with a deep hidden meaning, the art was worth the price. It was the signal, a callback to their very first conversation on the balcony, the moment her defiance had captured his attention. It was the spark that had started this inferno. For Elena, it was a private declaration in the midst of a war, a reminder of their beginning at what could be their end. For Marco, it was meaningless nonsense. For Dominic's hidden forces, it was the kill order. Before Marco could even process the shift in Dominic's tone, the warehouse erupted. The large metal doors at either end exploded inward, and teams of Dominic's men, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed in, moving with a silent, coordinated lethality. The chaos was absolute and overwhelming. It was not a firefight, it was a slaughter. In the ensuing pandemonium, Marco, his face a mask of shocked fury as he realized he'd been tricked, made a desperate final move. He lunged not for an escape route, but for Dominic, pulling a knife from his jacket. The two bosses, the two kings of the city's underworld, met in a final, brutal confrontation. It was not about territory or money anymore. It was personal. It was primal. Dominic, driven by a cold, focused rage, moved with the lethal grace Elena had witnessed once before. The fight was short, vicious, and decisive. He disarmed Marco with brutal efficiency, the knife clattering to the concrete floor. The final moments were a blur of motion that ended with Dominic standing over Marco's still form, his chest heaving, his expression one of grim finality. The threat was over. Permanently. Elena watched it all, her hand covering her mouth, her breath held tight in her chest. She had witnessed the full, terrifying, lethal extent of his power, the violent world she had willingly stepped into. When the chaos subsided and she saw Dominic emerge from the warehouse into the pre-dawn light, his suit torn, his face bruised, but alive and victorious, the terror, the tension, the fear, all of it dissolved, replaced by a single, overwhelming feeling. A wave of relief so profound it made her weak. Hours later, the sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The war was over. The penthouse was quiet again. The laptops and maps gone. The silence no longer tense, but heavy with the aftermath. Dominic had cleaned himself up. The bruises on his face were a stark reminder of the night's violence, but his eyes, as he stood beside her on the balcony, were calm. They watched the city wake up, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the distant skyscrapers. "Is it over?" Elena asked, her voice a quiet breath in the cool morning air. "He's gone," Dominic confirmed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The threat is over." He turned to her then, his eyes searching hers, his expression unreadable. "But this," he said, gesturing to the space between them, the charged air that always surrounded them, "is not." He laid it all out for her then, his voice low and steady, devoid of games or manipulation. He told her he could not change who he was, what he was. His world would always be violent. It would always be dangerous. There would always be another Marco, another threat, another war. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and he gave her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a choice. He could set her up with a new life, he explained. A new name, a new identity, anywhere in the world she wanted to go. She would be protected, safe, and she would never have to see him again. He would disappear from her life as completely as he had appeared. "This is your choice, Elena," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "No more games. No more cages. You can be free, truly free." It was the ultimate test of his feelings for her, the final, most difficult proof. He was willing to let her go, to tear his own heart out and live with the emptiness, if it meant she could have the life he had taken from her. It was the most selfless, most loving thing he had ever done. It was his confession, more powerful than any kiss, that her happiness meant more to him than his own. Elena listened, her heart aching with the depth of his sacrifice. She looked out at the city, her city, and thought about her old life, the clean lines of her blueprints, the quiet satisfaction of her work, the fierce independence she had guarded so carefully. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, a life that belonged to someone else. Then she looked back at the man in front of her, the man who had infuriated her, terrified her and captivated her. The man who had shown her a world of dark, terrifying passion she never knew existed, and who had, in the end, been willing to give it all up for her. She closed the small distance between them, and in a small, intimate gesture that felt more significant than any grand declaration, she reached up and straightened his tie, smoothing the silk fabric with her fingers. "My old life is gone, Dominic," she said softly, her eyes locked on his. "You blew it up the moment you laughed on that balcony. There's no going back." She took a breath, a slow smile spreading across her face. "And I don't want to." A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over his features, so profound it seemed to physically transform him. The weight on his shoulders lifted. The darkness in his eyes receded, replaced by a triumphant, brilliant light. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, and he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, his lips finding her hair. She tilted her head back, a playful, defiant glint in her eye, a flash of the woman she had been on the balcony. "But," she said, her tone teasing, "if you ever send me that many roses again, I will personally throw every single one of them off this balcony myself." He chuckled, a deep, rich sound of pure happiness that rumbled through her. He leaned his forehead against hers, his voice a low, affectionate growl, the words a familiar echo that had been transformed from a threat into a promise, an inside joke that sealed their unconventional, dangerous, and passionate bond. "Watch your mouth, beautiful,"